This program is a community education production brought to you by the Bar Association of Montgomery County and the Montgomery County, Maryland Bar Foundation. The program is designed to provide you with general information regarding your rights and obligations under the law. It is not intended as specific legal advice. You should discuss the facts and circumstances of any particular matter with your own attorney and obtain advice specific to your case. The participants are local attorneys who have volunteered their time to bring you this program. We hope you find it informative and beneficial.
Welcome to Law School for the Public. My name is Mark Gilday. I'm a partner in the law firm of Bregman, Burbridge, Schwartz & Gilday located in Bethesda, Maryland. Our show today is called Combating Gang Activity in Montgomery County. In the past few years, Montgomery County has witnessed an increase in gang activity. To combat this increase, Montgomery County has adopted a three-pronged approach. 1, prevention. This involves going into neighborhoods and working with at-risk youths to provide positive alternatives. 2, intervention. This involves the county's Health and Human Services Department and its outreach in vulnerable neighborhoods. The department provides a full range of services that includes social services, mental health services, and other services that strengthen the family network while trying to find the best way to help the child and the family divert from gang activity. 3, suppression. This involves the police department and the gang division of the Montgomery County State's Attorney's Office. Here to discuss how Montgomery County is combating gang activity are Patrick Mays and Brendan Johnston. Patrick is an assistant state's attorney with the Montgomery County State's Attorney's Office, where he is the chief of the felony gang unit. Patrick has tried numerous jury trials to verdict, including felony gang cases, physical and sexual abuse of children, and human trafficking. Brendan is a corporal with the Montgomery County Department of Police. He began working gang cases in 2002, and he is currently the assistant supervisor of the gang unit. Patrick, Brendan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And if I could begin with you, Patrick, and just ask the obvious question, which is, are there gangs in Montgomery County?
Yes, we have a variety of gangs geographically in all kinds of different parts in our community, and very reflective of all the different populations in our community.
And is that run up and down, east to west, north to south in the county, Brendan?
Yes, it runs all the way from south down Silver Spring to PG-DC border, all the way up to the Frederick area.
And you mentioned different types. How do we generally describe the types of gangs that we have in Montgomery County?
We have a mixture. We have some gangs that are you would know by name from national or international fame, whether that be or infamous, I guess, Crips or Bloods or MS-13 or Latin Kings that are nationally based, that are organized at some sort of national or beyond Montgomery County structure. We also have locally based neighborhood sort of sets or crews that are operating out of individual geographic areas, whether that be Montgomery Village, Germantown, or Gaithersburg, that are not tied into some broader structure or network. So we have a mixture, lots of different types of organizations.
And do each of these types of gangs have defining characteristics? In other words, be it, and without describing what those characteristics are, how can we distinguish one gang from another?
They like to identify themselves in different ways. A lot of the local gangs like to display things on social media through music and things like that, where they represent the neighborhoods that they're from. Other gangs like to display it through their clothing or hand signs. We'll see they'll choose a certain type of shoe or hat or certain brand that they will that the gang will wear.
And so that as these common characteristics evolve, you all on the law enforcement side can identify various types of gang by, be it the symbols or the clothing they wear?
Yes. Over time it's changed. 10, 15 years ago, it was very overt. A lot of people could walk down the street and pick out who was what. Now it's a lot more covert as to what they're wearing and the things that they do. But these are all things that we become aware of, and it helps us to identify some of these individuals.
Now, what about common characteristics among, for example, ethnic backgrounds? Do you find different ethnicities in one particular gang and another particular gang, or do you find that they intermingle?
For our local gangs, there's a lot of intermingling. It is based on the neighborhood that you grew up in, the neighborhood that you're living in. The national gangs, such as MS-13, that's more based on their origin. It's very big in the Central American population, so you see a lot more tight-knit in terms of ethnicity, being specifically Hispanic for that gang.
And what about age? Do you find, Patrick, that there's gang members from a very young age to a very old age, or at some point do they age out?
And I think that in some ways it's one of our most alarming trends that we're seeing in our uptick in violence is that not only are we seeing increased violence, but we're seeing increased violence at younger and younger ages. So we're now looking at really recruitment and sort of initiation into low-level gang, either being associates or lower-level criminality in middle school years for kids, so that by the time that they're in high school, they're fully members of these gangs, and they're fully capable, and we've seen this in recent months and years, capable of committing some of the most brutal, violent acts that you can imagine as a 15-year-old or as a 16-year-old. So I think we've seen a trend in violence, but we've also seen a trend in younger and younger perpetrators of that violence, which is concerning. To answer the second part of your question about folks exiting the gang or aging out, it's almost rare to see individuals that are well into their upper 20s. They're either dead, in jail, in custody of some other law enforcement agency. They just sort of, at some point, aging out isn't the right term, but cease to be able to be active for all of those risk factors that they undertake when they join.
For circumstances beyond their own control.
True.
Okay. Before we talk about recruitment and how kids are recruited into gangs, can you tell us how gangs operate? And by the term gang, to me, it implies that there's some sort of organized structure. Is there an organized structure within a gang? In other words, is there a hierarchy? Are there leaders that you mentioned, associates? How are they organized?
It depends on the gang itself. When we look at some of these national, international gangs, you do see that hierarchy. When you look at the gang, the largest gang in Montgomery County, MS-13, you see a hierarchy, a structure within each individual group. The local gangs, they don't seem to have as much organization as having that hierarchy. The people that have been around the longest, who have been in it the longest, carry more of that power, more of that status in the gang.
You mentioned MS-13, and is there any sort of central leadership within MS-13 with, let's say, Montgomery County, or does each little group operate independent of the other group?
I wouldn't say there's like a central for Montgomery County. For the area, there would be somebody that would be in charge of the area, but almost everything gets reported back down to El Salvador, and that's where the hub is and where most of the leadership is.
So there is a chain of command.
Yes.
And is that chain of command understood within the criminal enterprise within MS-13, for example, that you've got the new recruit, the associate, and then somehow they work their way up the...
It's very regimented, yes.
Okay. So give me an example, to the extent you can tell us, what that is and how that evolves.
From the recruitment from...
Well, let's talk about recruitment. How are kids recruited into gangs? And let's let's start with the street gangs, because we've talked about street gangs and then the national gangs. So street gangs. How are kids recruited into the street gangs?
A lot of that has to do with the neighborhoods that you grow up in, who your circle of friends are. And those neighborhood crews, a lot of times they put out these music videos and stuff on social media to kind of try and idolize themselves to have these younger kids look up to them. And you grew up in that neighborhood. You look up to these kids and you start to do what they do and hang out with them.
All right. And they are a lot less structured than the national gangs?
Yes.
All right, so then the national gangs, how do they, we'll use the example of MS-13, which you said that is the largest gang in Montgomery County?
Sure.
Okay.
We're seeing recruitment, we're seeing recruitment in schools or in surrounding areas in schools. We're seeing recruitment in neighborhoods that are predominantly inhabited by Central American, people of Central American descent. And we're seeing a number of tactics, I think, to include almost threats, that people are being threatened if they don't join a gang, or folks are telling us, well, I have to join a gang because someone is going to assault me if I don't join. So they're joining for protection potentially from other gangs or other groups. They're joining under pressure of threats. They're joining under pressure of threats to not just themselves but their family. And they're joining in a lot of that sort of particular climate. I think they're joining for that sense of family or belonging, because we're talking about really vulnerable population that doesn't have a lot of connection sometimes to other family members, other peer group, or other community connections in Montgomery County. And there's no doubt they're being targeted by MS-13.
So these minors, these young kids who come into the county, sometimes unaccompanied, is that correct? Sometimes or not, and they're targeted by the gang, and these are really the most vulnerable in our county, aren't they? These young kids. And so you said, Patrick, they're using threats to get them to join?
We're seeing threats not only locally here, threats against someone, if you don't join, we're going to assault you or we'll assault a family member, but we're seeing, I think, a disturbing trend and something not only in recruitment, but also in sort of some of the other criminality of these groups, where there are threats that are going back outside of the United States. And for law enforcement to address that kind of a threat, if you don't provide money, or you don't join, or you don't perform some task, we can target individuals. We know where you're from. We know what town you're from in Central America, and we can target, and we have the ability to exert force beyond the borders of the United States. That's a really terrifying thing.
And this is not just specific to Montgomery County?
No, not at all.
Okay. When we're talking about a national gang. We talked about young people. Is the recruitment mostly of the younger people, or do they recruit people of all ages? Let's talk about MS-13.
I would say mainly it's going to be younger people, but I mean, it could be anybody new to the area. And sometimes if it's not through threats, which we see, sometimes it's that individual's looking for that sense of family, that sense of belonging, mm-hmm. And they'll start to hang out with these people. They'll do favors for them, and they'll start to work their way up the structure.
And why do the gangs want to recruit the young people into their gang? What does the gang get out of it?
Numbers, power.
Okay. So power in numbers. Mm-hmm. The more members of the gang, the bigger the gang, the more they can do.
Yep.
And once someone joins a gang, and let's distinguish between the neighborhood gang and the national gang. Once someone joins a neighborhood gang, can they get out?
I think it's easier for them to, as they get older. If they move out of the area, they're no longer associated with. There's no. I mean, if you belong to a neighborhood gang in Gaithersburg, and you move to Richmond, Virginia, you know, there's not much that's holding you to that gang anymore.
Well, we talked about, Patrick, the aging out, if you will, of the national gang. You said that's not really going to happen because they're going to be locked up or dead or in custody somewhere. What about if a member of a national gang moves from Montgomery County to Richmond? Does that membership follow them, and there's a unit in
Absolutely.
Richmond?
Absolutely, it follows them all over the country, all over the world. If you're talking Central America, up here, if you're a member there and you come up here, there are certain things that is expected of you from the gang, and they will check up on you.
And with you all both working in the prosecutorial side and the law enforcement side, are you working with other agencies, both on the state level and federal level, with respect to dealing with the gang activity?
Yes.
Yes, it's a problem that obviously being in Montgomery County, touching Washington, D.C., touching Virginia, into other counties, and then across the East Coast, we're working with other local, state, federal law enforcement and prosecution units really across the country because of the transient nature of some of the individuals that are associated, particularly on the national side gangs. We've seen, I think, another very concerning trend, which is folks have the ability to commit a crime and then come to Montgomery County to hide out, or commit a crime in Montgomery County and go to another jurisdiction hundreds of miles away where they can then be sheltered. And it's because of that fluidity, something that coordination across jurisdictions has to take place.
And what types of crimes are these gangs committing? Let's talk about the neighborhood gang. What types of crimes are the neighborhood gangs committing?
They're involved in homicides, robberies, burglaries, drugs. You name it, they're doing it.
And what about the national gangs? For example, MS-13. Is there a specific type of crime that they are involved in, Patrick?
Yeah, the sort of money maker or revenue generator has typically been extortion, has been these rent type of rackets within the Central American community, where they're charging individuals for protection, sort of a classic organized crime. They're somewhat involved in the operation of illegal, underground brothels that exist in some of these communities. And then the violence. I mean, the violence is the concerning thing, and the violence is the thing that we've seen this uptick in. We've seen 20 gang-related homicides in Montgomery County in the last 2 years, where formerly we saw 0 or maybe 1 for many years in a row. And it's the exercise of that extreme violence in connection with the gang that is really concerning. But they're from the sort of organized crime, money raising perspective, it's really that extortion type of organizing that we're seeing.
And is it the members of the gang who are, let's say, the El Salvadoran gang, they're extorting their own community?
Absolutely. The victims in these communities are primarily, again, of the Central American descent. And they're the folks that are being extorted. They're the folks that are being robbed. They're the folks that are being, quite frankly, killed. And the vast majority of these murders that we're seeing are happening inside of some of these immigrant communities in Montgomery County.
So the gang is recruiting from the community, the most vulnerable, the young, and then extorting from their own community for, you call it a protection. In other words, you pay me money and what? Or if you don't
If
pay
you don't
me
pay
money,
me money, we'll come in, we'll burn your business or hurt someone.
And do you find, have you all come across any cases, Brendan, where a business or an individual has refused to pay the extortion?
Most of them just pay.
Okay.
They pay. They feel. I believe it's part of their way of life. That's what they understand from where they come from Central America. The way the gangs have control over the communities there, that they know that if they don't pay, either they can cause harm up here or they can cause harm back home. And most of the people that live in our community have relatives back home. So they're very concerned about that, and they just pay.
And are they threatening their relatives back home if they don't pay?
Yes, they'll threaten. They'll say, "Hey, if you don't pay, we're gonna we're gonna do harm to your relatives back home."
Do you find that the MS-13 gang is reaching outside of its own community and committing crimes outside of its own community, or is it primarily within its own community, Patrick?
I think primarily it's within the community, but there's a broader Hispanic community that's a large part of Montgomery County. I mean, so while it is sort of based out of El Salvador and run out of El Salvador, I think the victims of the crimes that are being committed are in neighborhoods that are inhabited by those of Hispanic descent, not just El Salvador, but of course Guatemala and Honduras and Nicaragua, which we have large populations of in Montgomery County as well.
And so these victims are not random. They are in fact targeted by the gangs, correct?
Yes, for the most part.
Okay. So let's talk about the three ways in which Montgomery County is combating gang activity. As I mentioned in the introduction, there's prevention, intervention, and suppression. With respect to prevention, Patrick, what is the state's attorney's office doing with regard to prevention?
So we have, for some time, we have been active in high schools and middle schools across Montgomery County. And one of, I think, the key programs that is run through our community prosecution division in the state's attorney's office is a truancy prevention program. It was started about 7 years ago, and it was started with our presence in 2 middle schools in Montgomery County. In January, we are going to be active in 20 schools in Montgomery County, and we're targeting individuals that have some of the worst school attendance rates. So in last year alone, we targeted about 650 students, middle school aged. What we saw were, as a result of 10 weeks of working with those kids, we were able to see a 60% increase in attendance for more than half of the individuals that we were working with. And so our feeling is, through that truancy prevention, if kids are in schools, if kids are not out on the street, they are not as likely to be targeted, they're not as likely to be able to be recruited and go down this path. So that's sort of one pillar of the programs we're working on. We are in development on prosecutors from my office, also from community prosecution, other units, also going in and talking to middle schoolers across the board about some of the perils of gang membership, and to sort of have some real facts about what we're seeing in the criminal justice system as real life examples of why living this lifestyle is not a good decision and is not sort of glamorous or something that anybody would want to see happen, because the results are something that we're trying to publish to those at-risk kids.
And so fair to say the state's attorney's office is putting a lot of resources into the prevention of gang activity, correct?
Absolutely.
And then Brendan, I believe with respect to the police department, you all are going into the schools, talking to the principals, the vice principals, the administration, and making them aware of what to look for so they too can help you all prevent the gang activity, correct?
Correct.
All right, and then the second step was the intervention, and that's primarily run by the county's Health and Human Services Department. And so if there is a problem that arises or you find a victim, you know who to refer the people to, correct?
That's correct.
And then lastly, we've got the suppression, that's the prosecution. And so from the police department's perspective, what have you done, and we got a couple minutes left, what have you done in the police department to suppress gang activity?
What we're doing now is we're expanding our size because of the volume of crime that we've seen recently. We've starting a second unit, so we'll have one unit that'll be able to focus on the long-term investigations of the gangs within the county, and we'll have a second branch that will be out there in the streets on a daily basis, interacting with gang members, trying to keep them off the street corners, and trying to keep the community safe.
And Patrick, in the state's attorney's office, what are you all doing on the suppression side?
Sure. We've just reformed a centralized gang unit in my office. We have an additional now 3 dedicated circuit court felony attorneys who are devoted to some proactive steps in working with our Montgomery County Police counterparts to target leadership structure in some of these gangs and use some proactive tools like grand jury investigation, proffer sessions, social media investigations to try and actually target individuals and make cases against them rather than being reactive and sort of waiting for some of the next violent statistics to hit. And that's been a push that has come via appropriation from the county council to both the police department as well as my office.
You mentioned appropriation from the county council. The county council has just appropriated approximately $1 million for both to be shared between the state's attorney's office and the police department, correct?
That's correct.
And that money is being used for prevention and suppression, correct?
That's correct.
All right, I want to thank you both. This has been an interesting topic. Certainly there's much more to discuss about combating gang activity in Montgomery County. However, we have run out of time in today's program. I would like to thank our guests, Patrick Mays and Brandon Johnston, for being with us today. Please let us know what you think of the show, as well as what topics you'd like to see on future programs by emailing us at lawschoolforthepublic@gmail.com. You can find this show and past shows online by searching Law School for the Public Montgomery and following the link. Please join us for future shows in our Law School for the Public series. On behalf of the Bar Association for Montgomery County, I'm Mark Gilday. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.